is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Human-induced climate change impacts are being seen throughout every aspect of the world we live in. Gradually shifting weather patterns, rising sea levels, and more extreme weather events are devastating evidence of both a rapidly changing climate and an urgent need for solutions. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change recently released a terrifying climate report stating that heating from humans has caused irreversible damage to the Earth that may get worse in the coming decades. As a result, still hotter heat waves, wildfires, and worse flooding will likely become even more extreme, even if we drastically cut greenhouse gas emissions. So while everyone around the world is feeling the effects of climate change, the most vulnerable are people living in developing and less developed countries, which includes most countries in Africa. So this week on the program, we look into the recent IPCC climate report, what is needed to avoid the worst effects of climate change and ensure action. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. The new IPCC report is a code red for humanity, says UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. The increased frequency and intensity of extreme weather events like hurricanes, wildfires and droughts is already threatening many lives around the world and driving people from their homes. A climate change impacted future is not inevitable. CGTN's Tony Waterman is in Brussels and has more on the IPCC report and its impacts of climate change around the world.
Crackling wildfires, raging rivers, devastating storms. Global scientists warning that climate change and its devastating effects are on the verge of getting out of control. In the coming decades, temperatures will be hotter, extreme events more frequent and severe.
Climate change is a problem that is here now. Nobody is safe, and it's getting worse faster.
The new landmark report issued by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says that unless there is immediate, rapid, and large-scale reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius would be beyond reach. Even under a best-case scenario, scientists say that threshold will likely be crossed in the next 2 decades, earlier than some past predictions. No region on the planet is spared, and the blame, for the first time, being put squarely on humans, who have failed to curb their reliance on fossil fuels despite decades of warnings from scientists.
It is indisputable that human activities are causing climate change and making extreme weather events more frequent and severe.
The world's oceans, ice sheets, and sea levels will suffer the worst fate. The report saying changes already underway will be irreversible for thousands of years, as heat trapped deep in the oceans will continue to cause melting.
We are damaging the climate in such a way for the next generations that this will certainly make the socioeconomic difficulties in the future much worse than in our generation.
Despite the dire warnings, the report does offer small glimmers of hope. The worst outcomes can still be avoided if the planet can bring emissions to zero in the coming decades and reverse deforestation.
The IPCC report comes just 3 months before global leaders meet in Scotland for COP26 climate negotiations. They are facing increased pressure to show up not only with more ambitious climate goals, but also with specific strategies on how to reach those goals. Even with their best efforts, though, the planet is changing, although the cost of inaction will be much higher. Tony Waterman, CGTN, Brussels.
Well, let's look into the IPCC report further, and I'm now joined by my guests in Johannesburg, Professor Colleen Vogel, acting head of the Global Change Institute. In London, Isabel Hilton, founder, China Dialogue, and in Lagos, Dr. Eugene Itua, CEO, Natural Eco Capital, all joining us via Zoom. And a warm welcome to you all. Professor Vogel, if I may start off with you, over 200 scientists from 65 countries have produced a devastating report on the danger that human-caused climate change poses to the world. First off, what makes this report different and what's your take on it?
I think it really has confirmed many of the previous assessments and put into stark reality some of the consequences that we're already facing. So I think the statements are becoming much, much stronger. There's more evidence in the report also about tipping points, which weren't really, I think, pulled out so much in the previous reports, etc. So the messages are just getting stronger, and the cases and the examples and the evidence also richer and stronger.
Talk to us a bit about the evidence, Professor Vogel. I mean, when you talk about the tipping point, what is the tipping point that the report is referring to, and where are we at the moment?
So I think the tipping points that they're talking about are things like the melting of the Greenland ice sheets, the West Antarctic ice sheets, the dieback of the Amazon forest, overturnings in the Atlantic Ocean, sea level rise, etc. So those are some of the tipping points, and I think most of them are we've already seen some of the evidence for those. And what's important, I think, in this report is that it shows that the melting of the Arctic, the acidification of the oceans, once you trigger these will go on for many, many years into the next generation as well. So that's the issue around the tipping points, which I think is important. So you start to get irreversible actions that start to run away, if you like.
Isabel, I want to explore that a bit further, because the first IPCC report, which was released in 1990, about 32 years ago, had actually concluded that the human-caused climate change would soon become evident, but was not very clear as to the extent and how it was going to go about that. What is the climate science indicating today, and how is that different from 32 years ago?
Well, as Professor Vogel has said, this report is much, much clearer. I mean, it is absolutely true that we have been warned about this for many decades. Scientists were relatively reluctant until relatively recently to attribute extreme weather events, for example, to climate change, and that attribution science has got much clearer. And what that means for policymakers and for the general public is that climate change is no longer something in the distant future. You know, we look around the world just this year and you can see the effects already beginning to play. And one of the difficulties about climate action has been this disconnect between what is happening now and what will happen in the future. The fact that we need to take action now to prevent something happening in the future. And that has proved very difficult for that translation of science into policy and into public perception. And I think with this report, partly because it is so much more evident, the effects are already playing out with just over 1 degree of warming. So we're not going back from here. All we can do is to prevent it going forward too fast. And that's really all that's left to us now. And I think that message has come across much more clearly in this report than it ever has before.
Right, we're going to look into that in a minute. But Dr. Itua, I want to get your thoughts on the fact that climate change is no longer in the distant future. And if you look at Africa's perception, though, Africa is struggling to mitigate and adapt to climate change, yet it is one of the lowest emitters, barely responsible for what's happening now. How do you see Africa, though, forcing its hand to have an equal say on what's going on with the climate?
Thank you very much. Rather than use the word forcing, I think I would want to say maybe work with or collaborate with others to ensure that Africa has its own share. We need our share to be able to deal with the challenges occasioned on us by climate change. And like I've just said, we are the lowest emitter, and yet we take the greatest brunt of all the challenges that we see, the risk. So in order for us to be able to work together, I think first and foremost, Africa should be able to place itself in position to negotiate adequately and appropriately. The fund that had been promised or that we were told will come in support of all of us, where is that fund? To what extent has Africa assessed it? How can we assess that fund? Can we work collaboratively? Yes, it is very possible. But first and foremost, the leaders in Africa should put themselves in a position to know what is actually happening. Those who also negotiate on our behalf should be able to know that. And indeed, just to say that when it comes to the issues of technology, what do we have comparative advantage on? If, for instance, most governments in Africa will say, okay, fine, most homes, let's get them powered via solar. And then let's, for instance, the hydro power that we have here,
right,
let them power the industries. Because there was a number of cases they will tell you, no, solar cannot power our industry. But again, we should be in position to say, through policy changes and so on and so forth, to say that, look, let's encourage our homes to be powered by solar. And then we deploy the existing grid to power our industries. That could happen and indeed make us more industrialized. But first and foremost, we must leverage on what is happening and then leverage on what we have.
All right, Isabel, we're talking about, the causes that have been made now being, irreversible. When we talk about irreversible, talk to us about the damage and where is this climate disruption most apparent?
Well, it's apparent in all the phenomena that we've seen, the extreme floods, the extremely high temperatures in the Arctic, for heaven's sake, and fires in the Arctic or the Pacific Northwest. We have droughts elsewhere. So in every geography, we're already seeing the impacts from Europe to China to Africa to South America. On what is reversible or not, we're talking about major climate systems which move very slowly, almost imperceptibly for quite a long time, and then can move very quickly. When ice melts, it melts slowly at first, and then it melts very fast. So we have set in train a set of events which could take millennia to reverse. I mean, one in particular that was highlighted, for example, in a recent paper from the Potsdam Institute in Germany, was the weakening of the ocean circulation. The ocean circulation, it transports warm air from the tropics to the northern climates and then from the Arctic to the tropics. So it's a regulator of temperatures in both places, and it depends on two things: salinity, a difference in salinity between one end and the other of the system, and a difference in temperature between one end and the other. We have changed both of those factors, and so the system is weakening. How long? How many hundreds of years would that take to reverse? These are very, very big systems, and we can affect our local behavior. We can adapt. We can build different. But when you set a global system in motion, it's very, very difficult to stop.
So there is a very interesting discussion here regarding global action and translating science into climate action. And Professor Vogel, let me start off with your thoughts here, because if we do know what human activity has caused the planet, and now we are being told that, it has caused irreversible damage, of hundreds of thousands of years. Clearly, we are not making progress on climate and environmental issues. Why not?
I think that's an interesting question. I think there's a lot of vested interests politically. I think to get political buy-in, we've seen some of the, recent presidents in different parts of the world who have been denialists. And so if you don't have that political buy-in right at the top, then it's very difficult to get policy into action. I think that's the one side. I think also for many people, there is an issue around pressing other challenges. And so I think until COVID, we didn't really think that we'd ever be struck by pandemics that could really cause problems. So I think there is a perception that we can deal with it down the line. We don't have to deal with it now. And so we have very little behavior change. We have very little action on the ground. But I also think, to be fair, the science might be very robust, and it is, but I think we also have problems about communicating and getting that message across in an accessible way so that people, civic society who want to play a role, can play a role. I, for example, am doing a lot of work with young people in the city of Johannesburg, and they are really, galvanizing and coming together around climate change. But they're also they're wanting skills, they're wanting more knowledge, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's a science practice policy problem, and we need to be finding those linkages and really developing them so that we can really move the debate along. So I think, the science is there. We're repeatedly saying it's there. It's over and over and over again. But now we need to move into the action space. And that will require us using, technologies cleverly, social media cleverly, interviews like this, raising awareness, social learning, etc.
On that note, let's take a short break. And when we come back, we'll have more on the latest IPCC climate report. To stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Let's continue our discussion. Still with me from Johannesburg, Professor Colleen Vogel. Joining me from London, Isabel Hilton, and joining me from Lagos in Nigeria, Dr. Eugene Etua. Professor Vogel, if I may get on with our discussion here and look at some of the solutions that could reverse the climate damage, because UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, while reacting to this report, said that solutions were clear and that inclusive and green economies, prosperity and clean air are all possible if we respond to the crisis with solidarity and courage. The solidarity and courage is the part I want to talk about, because what is the biggest barrier then to a more effective climate action, and how do we come together with that solidarity and courage to reverse climate change?
So I think that's a really tough question, but I think there are large inequities in the system. And so for some countries in the north, for example, it might be easier to get into green economies, into biofuels, etc., because they have better financial resources. But for those, for example, who are in Africa, that may not be possible. And so these inequities, I think, are going to have to be addressed. I'm presuming that for the next COP, financial issues, I think, are going to be putting onto the table. And I think it's going to be huge debates around how we can mobilize the funds that were promised to actually help mitigate the resources. Because in particular, if you look at Africa, it's many of the vulnerable who never even created this problem who are going to be mostly impacted by climate change in those contexts. And so I think there are these inequities, and I think Isabel already spoke about that. The system that's wired, it's been hardwired already, setting up these processes now has to start unlocking. And I think that's going to be one of the biggest challenges wherever one goes, whether it's in the South America, Central America, even in the UK. I think these disparities for me are fundamental. And then how do we then all, put the hands on the pump to try and address this?
So, Isabel, clearly there are solutions on the table that could be explored. So, in your view, though, what would be a most promising result in reversing the damage?
As long as I've watched global climate policy, much of it comes down to who does what and who pays, and that is still a lot of the argument. But within that rather simple proposition, things change all the time. So, for example, it is now cheaper in most geographies to build renewable systems than coal-fired power stations or gas or oil. And that is the result of rapid technological development and mass deployment of renewable technologies. It's had and dramatic effects. So economically, it makes no sense to build a system based on a 19th century technology when you can leapfrog at this point and go to the 21st century directly. It's like, who would build a fixed line telephone system now when we have mobile phones? It makes no sense to do the old-fashioned thing when you're looking to the future. That will be more resilient, and that will allow countries in Africa to develop in a clean, with clean energy, rather than building things which will have to be shut down in 15 or 20 years. So there are really positive choices that can be made, and I absolutely agree with what has been said about the responsibility of developed countries to fulfill their promises and to support where support is necessary. Some of these choices, though, are about leveraging Africa's natural advantages.
All right. Professor Vogel, I mean, we're hearing world leaders talking about, new policy measures as a matter of urgency to shift, the global economy probably to a more low carbon footing. When we talk about new policies that need to be looked at, exactly what are these new policies that could make a difference, and what is already there?
In my view, one of the biggest problems is that we've still got siloed policy. So if you go to most places in the world, we don't have a systemic view of how things connect. And I think, as was mentioned earlier, these problems are complex and they're wicked challenges, but they're complex. They're starting to interface with each other. So for example, in a disaster, it's not just one event that normally occurs, it's concatenating. So your response just can't be singular anymore. You have to have a multivariate response. And so in terms of the policies, I think what we've got in place in some areas are really good. We've got good water policies, good food policies, good health policies, etc. But as I think, in particular, as COVID has shown us, the system itself isn't geared up to operate when these massive challenges happen in a systemic way. And so you're still having people, and partly because I think the policies, the actual reward systems in policy systems tend to be key performance indicators. You do your job, and then that's your job, and then the next person does their job. And so in my experience, working in the city of Johannesburg, for example, right, for me, I think the biggest problem is that there is this lack of integrated policy where we can get synergies, where we don't have to waste time, where we can mainstream things and also do the SDGs at the same time, etc. And I don't think we're there yet, and that's going to take quite a lot of work.
All right. Isabel, I would like to hear your thoughts on that as well.
There are, if we're talking about Africa, I would look at farm level innovation. For example, solar-powered micro irrigation. It has been shown to increase yields by 300% and cut water usage by 90%. That's it's a win for the farmer, it's a win for food security, and it's a win for the climate. And it makes no sense not to implement policies like that. In terms of building resilience, which is another major and important element at this point, we are committed to a certain amount of climate change, and we will need to enhance our resilience. So, cutting down mangroves increases coastal vulnerability. Deforestation increases climate change. Building in the wrong place, building in the wrong way increases human vulnerability. So we need to look across the piece at all our systems. None of our engineering assumptions can be sustained in the future. Most of the assumptions on which we base our ideas of growth and development need to change to incorporate climate resilience. We need to be building circular economies, as Eugene is a great expert on that.
Right.
Economies that reuse and recycle and don't just have a kind of linear trajectory where we extract and waste.
Right. Dr. Itua, your thoughts, because I would like to hear from you as well what you think would need to change if we are to re-engineer climate action.
Thank you very much. The way we do the things we do, for instance, the abuse of natural resources, we have taken them for granted. And interestingly, we have, they are not there. They are finite in nature. We will not always have them if we do not manage them very well. And so the idea of the circular economy that Isabel just talked about, is there to assist us to close the loop of waste. It simply tells us to take, use, and return. But in addition to that, we also have this framework natural capital approach that builds on the fact that all natural resources are limited. If it is so, we must take decisions that take this into cognizance. In other words, we must mainstream natural capital as valuable asset. We must be able to value them and take recognition of that value in all our decisions. That will provide the pedestal to shift the curve of biodiversity loss that we are experiencing heavily now.
Right.
Then fight the climate change crisis, and of course, build the future where we all live and thrive harmoniously between man and nature.
All right. So as we build that future for humanity, Professor Vogel, I want to get your final comment on this and look up to the COP22, 26, I beg your pardon, that is coming up soon. What do you think should be on the table for that?
Gosh, again, I think there are a number of issues that are going to be on the table, you know, from finances, which I think is going to be a big one, to infrastructural development, to how we, you know, enhance early warning systems, to information, how people can make better risk decisions, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there are going to be a number of things, but in particular, I think latching onto that, this is now we have to really start to do things. So I think many people will be coming and debating on different, you know, technologies, on different policy instruments. You know, there's different side events. I think a lot of people will be sharing, but the urgency, I think, has to now start coming out. We can't just have talk shops. These have to be translated back when people go home into local policy making and into local practice.
Isabel, your thoughts?
I absolutely agree with that. And there has been a lot of criticism, for example, here in Britain, that the UK government, which is chairing COP26, chose this year of all years to reduce its overseas aid commitment. Not by that much, but as a signal. It was an absolutely terrible signal to send. And one of the difficulties that I think we're facing is that, you know, we're all struggling with a global pandemic. Economies have taken a terrible hit. It is one of the most difficult moments in history to say to electorates, you know, we have to give more money to other people. That's always complex, and now it's even more difficult, but it is absolutely essential. We promised 100 billion a year in Copenhagen to emerging economies to help them cope with climate change, and we've never managed to deliver that 100 billion. So that's the first priority. And, you know, Africa has a very strong voice in climate negotiations. These are global negotiations. COP26 will not be a success if it's not a success on that front. And you know, if COP26 isn't a success, then we are in big trouble, because this is the only global process that we have, and we have to make it work. We really have to make it work in Glasgow. For that, the rich countries have to cough up. One good thing is that we no longer have President Trump. That's a great advantage, and President Biden is at least understands the problem and is committed. But it's not going to be easy, but I think that there is a real sense of urgency in the process now.
Thank you very much indeed, all of you, for a very incisive discussion. But that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to our panel of experts. In Johannesburg, Professor Colleen Vogel, acting head of the Global Change Institute. In London, Isabel Hilton, founder, China Dialogue. And in Lagos, Dr. Eugene Itua, CEO, Natural Eco Capital. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation online through Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And do join us again next week for more on Talk Africa. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Until next time, goodbye.